Inside the sweltering heat of the mechanical workshop, where the air is constantly thick with the smell of burning metal, grease and welding smoke, the man was holding a heavy piece of metal that had long been broken in half. Do you know what it is? It is part of the drivetrain from a large truck, an extremely important component responsible for transmitting power throughout the massive vehicle. Just one glance is enough to tell that it had endured an incredibly violent impact. The thick steel body had been torn apart into twisted, jagged shape, its cracked edges looking as if some enormous force had snapped it clean in two. The old mechanic gently placed the damaged part onto the concrete floor covered in metal dust before bending down to inspect it closely. His face was stained with grease, and deep wrinkles marked the years of hard labor he had endured. Eyes long accustomed to the blinding light of welding sparks carefully studied every tiny crack across the metal surface. He repeatedly tapped the damaged steel lightly with his hand, listening carefully to the sound it produced, almost as if experience alone could tell him whether the inside was still solid enough to be restored. In many modern places, damaged parts like this would most likely be thrown away immediately. People would simply order a brand new replacement and install it instead, but here things are very different. A new drivetrain component could cost as much as several months of income for a working family. That is why, even if there is only the slightest chance of repairing it, the mechanic will still do everything they can to save. After carefully inspecting the damage, the mechanic and several others carried the broken end of the drivetrain over to an old lathe machine sitting in the corner of the workshop. The machine was covered in black oil stains and layers of metal dust, while most of its paint had peeled away over the years. It had probably been there for decades, working tirelessly day after day without rest. Yet despite its worn-out appearance, the mechanics viewed it as one of the most valuable tools in the entire workshop. They carefully secured the heavy metal piece onto the rotating chuck of the lathe. The aging motor began to rumble heavily before gradually speeding up. The massive chunk of steel started spinning rapidly, producing a deep humming sound that vibrated through the floor. The mechanic then took out a sharpened metal rod and gently pressed it against the spinning surface to mark the cutting line. Every step was done purely through experience. There were no electronic screens, no modern laser measuring systems. Everything depended entirely on the mechanic's eyes and instincts. After several minutes of adjustment, he slowly moved the cutting tool closer to the spinning metal. The moment the blade touched the steel surface, bright orange sparks exploded everywhere. The harsh sound of metal grinding echoed throughout the workshop as layers of red-hot steel were shaved away, curling into thin strips before falling onto the floor. The smell of burnt metal quickly spread through the air. The mechanic remained calm, his rough, callous hands controlling the machine with incredible precision. Just a tiny mistake could completely ruin the entire component, but jobs like this seem to have become part of his life long ago. With every steady cut, a fresh shiny layer of metal slowly appeared beneath the rough and fractured surface. In many Western countries, old-fashioned lathes like this might have been considered outdated years ago. Modern factories now use fully automated CNC systems capable of achieving near-perfect precision. Operators simply enter measurements into a computer and the machines handle everything automatically. But in many poorer regions of the East, old lathe machines like this still play an incredibly important role. They are like the heart of the workshop itself. Thanks to them, mechanics can repair almost anything, from truck axles and industrial gears to enormous machine components that would otherwise be treated as scrap metal. When the damaged section had finally been completely removed, the last twisted piece of metal dropped heavily onto the floor with a loud crash. Now the drivetrain revealed a much flatter and smoother cut surface, but the work was far from finished. This was only the beginning. The mechanics then searched through piles of old material stacked behind the workshop, looking for a steel pipe that could fit the drivetrain structure. After taking measurements with mechanical calipers and estimating dimensions by eye, they finally selected a steel pipe with nearly the correct size. That piece of steel was then mounted onto the lathe again for further machining to ensure a tighter fit. Layer after layer of metal continued to be cut away. Tiny sparks flew continuously like fireworks inside the dark, smoke-filled workshop. Sweat poured down the mechanic's face, but he barely seemed to notice. His hands remained firmly on the controls, while his eyes never left the spinning steel. Once the machining was complete, they inserted the steel pipe between the two broken ends of the drivetrain. Thanks to the pressure and alignment capabilities of the lathe, the parts slowly came together almost perfectly. The mechanic repeatedly checked the measurements to ensure the shaft was properly centered. Even the slightest misalignment could cause violent vibrations when the truck operated at high speed, eventually leading to another catastrophic failure. Once everything was properly secured in place, the welding process began. A younger mechanic carried over the welding machine, lowered his own protective mask, and ignited the electric arc. Brilliant blue-white flashes instantly burst into the air one after another. The sharp sizzling sound echoed throughout the workshop. The mechanic did not immediately weld one long seam. Instead, he continuously made small tack welds around the shaft first to hold the two metal sections firmly in place. This was an extremely important step because if heat caused the metal to expand unevenly, the entire component could become warped or misaligned. Only after making sure everything was stable did he begin laying down longer welds. Blue-white sparks scattered everywhere like heavy rain. Streams of glowing molten metal slowly filled the crack between the two steel sections. The smell of welding smoke mixed with the scent of engine oil made the air feel more suffocating than ever, yet nobody stopped working. Inside this mechanical workshop, everyone had long become accustomed to it. In another corner of the workshop, several very young boys were quietly watching the adults work. Some of them were only 14 or 15 years old, yet their hands were already covered with small cuts and burn marks. The sound of hammers striking metal and the bright flashes of welding sparks had become part of their everyday lives. In this place, everyone has to work in order to survive. For many poor families, education sometimes has to give way to the struggle for food and daily living. As soon as they are physically strong enough, these children enter mechanical workshops learning how to hold hammers, operate welding machines, remove bolts, and lift heavy steel parts several times heavier than their own bodies. No one teaches them through books or classrooms. Every bit of knowledge is passed down through practical experience. From listening to the sound of an engine to guess what is wrong inside, to judging the temperature of heated metal by its color, or learning how to create a clean weld without air pockets, all of these skills are earned through years of labor and countless injuries on their hands. Some days, the temperature inside the workshop becomes almost unbearable. Old electric fans spin slowly, barely enough to push away the heat coming from the machines and welding flames. Sweat soaks through the workers' clothes from early morning, yet they still continue working for hours without stopping. Because if the truck is not repaired on time, its owner will have no vehicle left to earn a living. After many continuous hours of work, the final welds were finally completed. The drivetrain had now become one solid piece once again. The mechanic lightly tapped around the welded area with a hammer to check its strength before mounting the component back onto the lathe one more time to rebalance the rotating shaft. And the freshly welded steel was gradually machined smooth, revealing a shiny surface that barely showed any sign that it had once been broken in half. The mechanics stood quietly around the machine, silently observing the result of their work. Nobody said much, but the satisfaction in their eyes was obvious. For many people, this might simply look like repairing a damaged object, but for the workers inside this mechanical workshop, it is the way they keep life moving forward. Every machine part restored means one more truck can return to work, one more family can continue earning money, and the mechanics themselves can keep surviving day by day. Amid the screeching sound of the lathe, the sharp clanging of hammers, and the constant flashes of welding sparks, these workers continue laboring silently every single day. There is no modern technology, no clean factory environment, and no expensive equipment. Only experience, physical strength, and relentless determination allow them to bring seemingly worthless piles of scrap metal back to life. After securing the inner core, the workers carefully positioned the remaining part of the drivetrain back into its original place. This step required an extremely high level of precision, because even the slightest misalignment between the two shaft ends could cause violent vibrations when the truck operated at high speed, possibly leading to another catastrophic break. The mechanic stood silently in front of the old lathe machine, carefully observing every small detail. Using both hands, he slowly rotated the shaft to check how well the metal surface meshed together. His rough, callous fingers, hardened by years of labor, continuously slid along the freshly machined steel edges, sensing even the tiniest misalignment almost by instinct. There were no modern laser scanners or electronic alignment systems. Everything depended entirely on experience accumulated through many years of work. Once he felt the two ends of the drivetrain meshed together almost perfectly, the mechanic began making the first tack welds to temporarily secure the metal sections together. Blue-white flashes continuously lit up the dim mechanical workshop. The sizzling sound of welding echoed throughout the hot building, mixing with the slow rotation of the lathe to create the familiar atmosphere of a traditional repair shop. Those first welds were only as small as fingertips, but they played an extremely important role. They held the two metal sections steady during the next stages of alignment. The mechanic did not rush into making long welds immediately, because he understood that if the shaft was not properly centered, all the work done so far could become meaningless. After temporary fixing was completed, they started the lathe again to test the drivetrain's alignment error. The old machine produced a deep rumbling sound as it slowly rotated the massive steel shaft. Each rotation moved steadily before the mechanic's eyes. He leaned in closely, carefully observing the end of the shaft without blinking. Inside the thick air filled with grease and welding smoke, everyone around him also watched in complete silence. They understood that this was the crucial moment that would determine whether the drivetrain could operate smoothly or not. Even the slightest wobble or imbalance could create powerful vibrations once the truck returned to real-world operation. After only a short period of use, the bearings, gears, or even the entire drivetrain system could fail once again. The mechanic suddenly raised his hand, signaling the machine to stop. It seemed he had noticed a very slight misalignment that most ordinary people would never be able to see. Without the slightest bit of haste, he picked up a small steel hammer and began tapping gently and precisely along the shaft body. At first glance, those hammer strikes looked simple, but in reality they required years of experience and skill. The mechanic had to apply just the right amount of force to correct the misalignment without deforming the metal structure itself. Some of the taps were so light they barely touched the steel surface. Yet when the machine was started again, the shaft became noticeably more stable. He repeated the process over and over again, testing the rotation, stopping the machine, observing carefully, then making tiny adjustments little by little. Sweat ran down the mechanic's face and soaked into his oil-stained shirt collar. Yet his hands remained incredibly steady and precise. The younger workers standing nearby watched every movement closely because this was the kind of experience that books could almost never teach. After many rounds of adjustment, the drivetrain finally began spinning far more smoothly. The end of the shaft was now almost completely free from vibration. The mechanic gave a slight nod before moving on to the final welding stage. This time he no longer made only small tack welds. Instead, he began laying long, solid weld beads around the entire drivetrain shaft. The electric arc flashed continuously, creating a blinding blue-white light. Red-hot sparks exploded everywhere like fireworks. Molten metal slowly filled the gap between the two steel sections, joining them together into a single solid piece. It was obvious that the mechanic's workmanship was extremely professional and meticulous. The welds were smooth, even, and nearly uninterrupted. It showed just how experienced he was with this type of work. Over the years, he had probably repaired countless heavy mechanical components just like this one. What was even more surprising was that throughout the entire process, they used almost no professional protective equipment. No modern face shield, no fire-resistant clothing, no thick specialized gloves. Some of them were even working completely with bare hands hardened by grease, heat, and years of labor. In many developed countries, this would almost never be allowed. Safety regulations in modern factories are extremely strict. Missing even a single piece of protective equipment could result in work being stopped immediately. But here, such dangers seem to have become an ordinary part of everyday life. Red-hot welding sparks continuously fell onto the workshop floor. Thick welding smoke filled the entire space, making it more suffocating than ever. Yet the workers continued their jobs as if they had long grown accustomed to it. After finishing all the welds, the mechanic once again mounted the drivetrain onto the lathe. This step was meant to remove the excess metal around the welded areas, helping the surface become smoother and more balanced. The lathe started spinning again. The cutting tool slowly moved toward the steel that had just been welded moments earlier. Thin layers of metal were shaved away, curling into glowing red spiral strips before falling onto the floor. The rough weld marks gradually disappeared, replaced by a much smoother and shinier metal surface. With every pass of the cutting tool, the drivetrain began to look almost like a single solid piece together with the original metal. Without very careful observation, it would have been difficult to tell that this component had once been completely broken in half. After many continuous hours of work, the final product was finally complete. A component that once looked fit only for the scrapyard had now been brought back to life once again. The mechanics stood quietly around it, looking at the result of their labor. There were no cheers, no words of praise, only silent satisfaction visible on their grease-covered faces. Shortly afterward, they carried the drivetrain back to the truck parked outside the workshop. Under the intense heat of the sun, several men worked together to lift the heavy shaft underneath the vehicle and carefully reinstall it into its original position. The sound of metal tools clanking echoed continuously. Large bolts were slowly tightened using old wrenches darkened by years of use. Looking at the entire process, it is clear that almost everything was done completely by hand. There were no robotic arms, no modern automated production lines. Everything depended entirely on the experience, strength, and skill of the mechanics. In wealthier countries, severely damaged components like this would probably have been replaced long ago. People there often prioritize speed and maximum safety over manual repairs. But here, they try to rebuild and restore everything possible, extending the life of the truck for as long as they can. For many drivers and truck owners, that truck is the most valuable asset their family has. It is not just a vehicle used for transporting goods, but also their source of income, the thing that helps them earn money every day to support their wives and children. The trucks here are often forced to operate continuously under extremely harsh conditions. They carry overloaded cargo across long roads filled with potholes, dust, and severe damage. Because of that, the mechanical parts wear out very quickly and frequently suffer serious breakdowns. That is why small repair workshops like this are appearing more and more everywhere. Some of them are nothing more than temporary tin roof structures built along the roadside, contain a few old lathe machines and several highly experienced mechanics. Some cases, they do not even have official business licenses. As long as they have the skills, people can still make a living by repairing trucks that have become worn out after many years of use. What many places would consider worthless scrap is seen here as a valuable asset. A broken drivetrain shaft can still be restored. An old truck must continue operating for many more years simply because they have no other choice. Even though the work is filled with countless dangers, these mechanics continue doing it every day for their families, for food on the table, and for survival. They work cramped overheated spaces filled with noise and the constant risk of accident. Yet through experience and determination, they always try to complete the job as best as they can. After struggling with the final assembly and performing one last inspection, everything finally returned to its proper place. The driver climbed into the cabin and started the engine. The heavy sound of the diesel engine echoed steadily through the workshop. Slowly the truck rolled out of the repair shop and continued its long journey down the roads ahead. No one knows how long the repaired drivetrain will continue working. It could last a few months or perhaps several years, but one thing is certain. The mechanics here have extended the life of the truck once again. Through nothing more than their own hands and experience despite the hardships of life, they continue doing this difficult work quietly every single day. They are not famous and very few people know their names, but they are the ones keeping countless trucks running, keeping goods moving from place to place, and helping many families continue earning enough money to survive. What do you think about the skills of these mechanics? Leave your opinion in the comments below. And for now, goodbye and see you again in the next video.